All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, there's been so many comic book movies recently, mostly Marvel, DC, and I've just been thinking in the back of my mind, how come the only comic book stories that exist are about superheroes? There's nothing about ordinary people.
Well, why would anyone want to read that? That sounds fucking gay.
That does sound gay, boring, fake. It's just all of it. But imagine if somebody had done that.
I'd rather not.
Like,
What's it just going to be a bunch of stories by some neurotic sad sack about the gloomy city he lives in and how he goes to the same job every day and how he just, leads a rich life of the mind, but he has trouble sharing those thoughts and feelings with anyone around him? What, something like that? You want to read that? Some guy that writes little stories about people he meets that never get to tell their stories and says, oh, this is actually a really interesting person.
I'm literally doing voice to text on Google right now, and it brought up a guy named Harvey Pekar. Who the hell is that?
I mean, there's a few of them in the Columbus area.
Well, you know what? There was actually a movie made about him, interestingly enough.
Does it have a post-credits stinger? Are there sequels?
There are not, unfortunately. He died very shortly after the movie came out. Well, you know what? Fuck it. We're just going to review American Splendor this week because we got nothing fucking better to do. So without further ado, let's get into our review of American Splendor. Yeah, now, Brian, of course, this was your choice for this week's episode. Why did you want us to review American Splendor?
So, just get this out of the way. I am coming at this from a bias. This is potentially my favorite movie ever. Not necessarily that the movie itself is so good, but Pekar overall, he speaks to me a lot. I really like him. And one of the things that I try to kind of get back to on the show, because of course we talk about generational ideas or ideals of generations, even if they aren't necessarily accurate. We talk about how art or artists are reflected in their generation and how they're changed. But even though that's sort of a loose tentpole of what we talk about, I kind of think that all the generational politics are kind of bullshit. Every time I see someone my age, again, the show is Millennials Are Old. Every time I see some 30-something go like, oh, it's all these boomers. Everything is a boomer's fault. It makes me kind of sick because it's ahistorical. And also because I see no evidence that millennials aren't doing the exact same bullshit that the boomers did, but with less good art about it. Thinking about that, well, who is kind of a consummate boomer? Someone who embodies a lot of the things that we think of as boomer qualities and is still transcends those generational things. Is someone that I think could speak to a lot of the NUI, both valid and imagined, that millennials and Zoomers whine about. And I think Harvey Pekar is a really good example of that. He's someone who, again, total boomer, came up in the 60s, he's into fucking jazz, not a hippie, he's kind of like a latter-day beatnik, but he was able to reach through into that kind of, that early ironic Gen X thing is kind of in him, or, a predecessor to it. And then I was thinking, he writes a lot about his anxiety. He writes a lot about, he doesn't describe himself as an arrested adolescent, but I feel like that's a big thread in his work, is that he's kind of a man-child, just not in the obvious ways, which I think is the thing that a lot of people our age talk about, is feeling like they never really grew up. And really, I just want to talk about Harvey Pekar. We'll talk about the movie, of course, but I want to use that as kind of a jumping off point to just talk about him and his work, because an incredibly influential person and someone that I do think is a boomer, for lack of a better word, that could speak to a lot of younger people in ways they might not expect.
Yes, very much so. I was aware of this movie because you've been talking about it forever. I remember seeing it around the time we became friends, so probably 7, 8, 9 years ago-ish for the first time, and I remember really liking it. Of course, I love Paul Giamatti. I've known Paul Giamatti for a long time. Of course, he was Rhino in Amazing Spider-Man, the first one, I think. And
his most celebrated role.
His most celebrated role. He was, of course, in Big Fat Liar, which is one of the best kids movies of the 2000s. Unironically, I believe that. It's a great fucking movie.
Where he did not blue himself, but he was blue by someone else. He was blue by a child.
He got the paint directly from Tom Laughlin to make himself blue. But no, I love fucking Paul Giamatti. So, of course, well, before we get too deep into the movie itself, Paul Giamatti is Harvey Pekar, and he does a fucking phenomenal job as Harvey Pekar. I think we can all agree on that.
Best possible person they could have cast. Harvey Pekar also appears as himself periodically in the film as a narrator, and he does comment on it. Well, he doesn't look anything like me. That's true, and I'm going to be as nice to Pekar as I can. Again, I love him. Love the man to pieces. Paul Giamatti is the idealized Hollywood pretty boy version of Harvey Pekar.
I mean, that's the thing, though, is that if there was ever a pretty boy idealized version of Matt Christman, that would be fucking Paul Giamatti, too.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, Jesus. But yes, let's get into some of the details of the movie before we talk too much about Harvey Pekar here. So, this movie came out in 2003. It was rated R, mostly for language. And there's some language in here, but it's not particularly egregious. There's no nudity, unfortunately. I really wanted to see Paul Giamatti's taint, but I wasn't able to see that, unfortunately. This movie was directed by the film duo Sherry Springer Berman and Robert Pulcini. It was written by them as well. And it was produced by many people, including Ted Hope, who was the only producer that had a Wikipedia credit, so he's the only one I included on here. And Sherry Springer Berman and Robert Pulcini are most well known for this film, of course, The Nanny Diaries, the film The Extra Man, an episode of Shameless, and a few episodes of the TV show Succession, which, of course, Paul Giamatti was on the TV show Succession as well. And Ted Hope is most known for producing many, many films, but he's known for producing films for such filmmakers as Ang Lee, Todd Field, Michel Gondry, and once again, Sherry Springer Berman and Robert Pulcini, among many others. The film is about 101 minutes long. It had a budget of $2 million and it grossed $8.7 million. And on Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 94% critic score and an 86% audience score.
I was just thinking, it does make sense to me that this audience score is a little bit lower than its critic score. As a film, I mean, there isn't a whole lot of personality to the direction of this movie. It is basically kind of meant to reflect just Pekar's content. Pekar, as a writer, has a ton of personality, and he works with artists who bring a lot of dimension to his work. I will say, I feel like this movie, its editing, its overall pacing, it is kind of just there to say, this is this guy, Harvey Pekar. This is, a condensed version of his life. I don't think there's particularly that the filmmakers have a strong worldview or perspective.
No, in fact, they're almost kind of documentary filmmakers in the way they shoot this movie. They do interject a little bit here and there in sort of fourth wall breaking segments, but for the most part, they have a pretty dry, documentary-ish feel to the telling of this biography of Harvey Pekar.
And most of the kind of fourth wall breaking stuff, most of the, I guess, the cute stuff, it's mostly in the first third of the movie. And I kind of wonder if they put that in there because they felt like they needed to ease the audience into the idea that this is a guy who does comic books, but they're a different kind of comic book than you know.
Well, that's the thing. This would have been the perfect comic book movie is if when we first see Harvey Pekar, if he would have said, well, you're probably wondering how I got here, and then a record scratch would have happened.
So the film actually does start with, I think, a very un-Harvey Pekar scene, which is the kids trick-or-treating dressed as superheroes, and then a lady won't give child Harvey Pekar candy. That's a good introduction to Pekar as a person and kind of how what he did was important to comic books. It parallels him with all of the brightly costumed superheroes. But I don't know if I think Pekar ever would have written something like that, something that was quite so jokey.
Having read a little bit of the comic and read a little bit about him, I don't imagine he would have made that.
I think it's a good introduction to, especially for the movie. It's basically like, hey, here's who this guy is. Of course, the lady gets to him, says, what kind of superhero are you supposed to be? And the child Harvey Pekar says, I'm not a superhero. I'm just some kid from the neighborhood. And it's goofy accent. Good introduction to the person for a film audience. One of the moments where you're okay, they're moving it up a little bit to kind of simplify this story. Because another thing about Pekar's work, and in preparation for this, I reread both of the kind of American Splendor anthologies of the classic prints. So I pretty much reread all of the strips that are adapted in this movie. I did not read Our Cancer Year for this, but most of the 70s and early 80s ones. And the film overall, pretty accurate in content to his writing. There's a lot of times where either things are condensed because it's a movie, they condense a couple of scripts, and we'll get to this a few times, where the content of what happens is very accurate, because it usually is. The film does not take a lot of liberties with Harvey's words or things that happen, and really, I do believe tries not to take liberties with his worldview. The filmmakers try as well as they can to represent how the real Harvey felt, but they do and they do a thing that I'm sure drove the real Harvey Pekar crazy. They will take things that are in the story, and they'll make them just cinematic enough that it sort of changes the feel of them. They'll make things more controversial, or they'll make things sadder than they were, just a little bit sadder, just a little bit angrier. And it sort of changes the tone, because the actual tone of his comic books is very understated. It's always understated.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, you're definitely the bigger comic book and artist-like person of us. So I've never really read any of Harvey Pekar's works or anything like that.
That's perfect, because I have a few points as we get through the film that I'll point out, because it is interesting. The film is very accurate for the most part, with a couple of exceptions to his work. And his work, he prided his work on being very accurate to his perception of reality. But it's funny how there are times when, if you compare a scene in the movie to the comic strip it's based on, it's kind of like they've juiced it up. They've made it flow more like a story, because Harvey Pekar didn't write like a narrative. He wrote thought exercises and little character pieces, or very short little stories about his day-to-day life or people he knew. So this movie is given the perhaps unenviable task of stringing those things into a narrative. And that type of narrative is something that Pekar straight up avoided for the first 20 years of his career, almost had contempt for as a writer. And I would say that the movie does a pretty good job of making that work.
And you know what? Speaking of the narrative, let's continue the narrative of this episode and talk about some trivia about the production of this movie. So the first piece of trivia I have here is NBC would not lease out the actual Late Show with David Letterman footage where Harvey Pekar finally lashed out at Letterman. So the scene had to be recreated with actors. Now, this is one of the few things with Harvey Pekar that I actually did do a little research before doing this episode, because I did watch that segment and it is pretty tense, but it's not as tense as portrayed in the movie. It's not as confrontational. And then also as well, he was on the Letterman show a couple times after that.
Couple months after.
Yeah, so clearly David Letterman did not have that much animosity towards him, because in the movie it's basically just like, well, this is the last time he was ever on TV, but that's not really the case.
They do imply that was like the end of his time on Letterman. That's actually one of the prime scenes where I would say that the film differs from how Pekar wrote about it too, in ways that are kind of interesting.
So the next piece of trivia I have here is all the White Room documentary scenes were filmed in one day, which I thought was really cool. I assume all the White Room documentary scenes were the ones with Harvey in it. That strikes me as so Harvey that he does one day of effort.
That's what I'm thinking, is that he only would do one day. He said, I'll give you one day.
Well, and they even show in the movie where you were talking about the fourth wall breaking stuff. He's like, well, you got 4 takes of that. You should be able to edit something together pretty well on that.
I absolutely believe that Harvey did not want to be there doing that. I think that I have in the past tried to see if he ever commented on this film. And it seems like he's very complimentary to it, because they made a movie about him, and it's a movie that, makes him look good. But I don't know if he liked the movie.
That's fair. I doubt he showed this film regularly to visitors.
Not necessarily that it was bad, but, just seems like it would weird him out, to have a movie about himself. But also just, he didn't really like that many movies. He liked Godard and shit like that,
He was more of a music, records, and comic guy more than anything else.
Big music. One of his jobs, his side jobs, along with making comics, was he was a music critic for many, many years.
I remember they mentioned that he had an album review coming up. They didn't really mention that in the film other than that line, though.
Yeah, he writes about it quite a bit.
Well, speaking of films, the next trivia fact I have here is the director, Jonathan Demme, who is most well known for directing such films as the original Silence of the Lambs, the movie Philadelphia, and the remake of The Manchurian Candidate, had tried to adapt a film version of American Splendor in the 1980s, but the project never came to fruition as Demme was not an established director. So I thought that was very interesting. A man who arguably made one of the best, if not the very best, police procedural of all time.
Yeah.
Wanted to make a Harvey Pekar biopic, or at least adaptation of Harvey Pekar's work. That's really
I did not know about that. I'm very interested. Kind of glad that didn't happen, because all I can think is how in the 80s American Splendor is still kind of going. By the time this movie came out, Harvey was not writing all the time, but he wasn't writing comic books all the time. But I'm thinking about Pekar's friend, Robert Crumb, who had a movie adaptation of his iconic character, Fritz the Cat, in the 70s while the comic was still being published, and how he was so dismayed by it and the popularity it enjoyed that he killed the character off. And I'm thinking, boy, I wonder if a movie had been made in the 80s and Harvey hated it, would he have quit doing the comic strip?
You know, that's certainly possible. It would not strike me as a particularly un-Harvey Pekar move to do something like that.
Whereas now, by the time this film was made, enough time had been passed to where Pekar and his work in the 70s and 80s had sort of been canonized by the comic book community.
No, very much so. And the last trivia fact I have here, actually, I have two more. I actually added one just as I was doing research, but the one I have in the script here. So the artist Gary Dumm, who was a American Splendor artist, is the gray-haired man getting his copy of Our Cancer Year autographed at the end of the movie. So I thought that was a cute little cameo there.
Yeah, that's nice.
And then also the very last fact I have here is, we're talking about how this sort of characterization, Harvey Pekar, the figure, could sort of be re-examined as a elderly millennial in the elderly millennial lens. So here's how that lines up with that idea. So this movie was written in 2001. Filming began in September of 2001, and filming ended the month of September 2001. So this movie happened during 9/11, which is very interesting because there is a scene where, of course, when Harvey goes to New York City to do the David Letterman interviews, they show a skyline of New York, but there was no World Trade Center in there. I wonder when that shot was made.
Yeah, no shit. If you wanted to get really symbolic with this, you could say that Harvey Pekar was dragged into the mainstream, ushered into the mainstream with this film as 9/11 changed America.
That's just so beautiful. Just like how with 28 Days Later, the same thing happened because they shot that movie when 9/11 happened too. So
that is almost spooky, just given the tone of that movie, because it feels so post 9/11 to me.
Well, if you do remember from our episode, and by the way, everybody, please re-listen to all of our episodes at once on all of your devices. But 28 Days Later episode, I remember the fact is during the grocery store scene, that's when 9/11 happened. That was the shooting day.
Oh, yeah.
Which is like one of the few scenes of like showing a little bit of like return to normality in that movie. And then just 9/11 happens.
Not so fast.
All right, well, speaking of normal things, let's get into the film synopsis here. So, of course, you mentioned the very first scene. So, during Halloween in 1950, an 11-year-old Harvey Pekar refuses to dress up as a superhero while trick-or-treating. The scene then shifts to an adult Harvey Pekar, once again played by the actor Paul Giamatti, walking the gritty Cleveland streets. Then the real Harvey Pekar appears in a documentary-style setup. And I really like the intro of this movie because it's filmed and composed like a comic strip. You just see Paul Giamatti walking down the street, and then you see actual Harvey Pekar walking down the street, and it's told in various comic panels with comic Harvey Pekar doing various lines of dialogue there. I really enjoyed it. It's a really good opening sequence.
It's great. I also kind of wonder if this is a thing where the filmmakers were like, we need to make it clear right up front that this guy makes comic books because he's so different from your average person's perception of what a comic book writer is or what they write about.
That is true because, even though this movie came out in 2003, it was shot in 2001. And at that point, comic book movies as we know it today weren't really a thing at all.
Yeah, they start really with X-Men and with Spider-Man.
Yes, and I would argue probably the single most important film of like the early modern comic book movie is probably Blade.
That's the proof of concept for the comic book blockbuster.
Exactly. So yeah, when this movie came out, it was really only the first X-Men movie and Blade, and that's it when this movie was filmed. So they basically had to be like, how do we create the idea of a comic book movie?
Yeah, well, it's that, and then also that this is a whole different type of guy. They're like, well, we need to not only introduce people to this guy, to his worldview, to his life, to the people he knows, but to this whole other type of comic book that most of the audience has never heard of.
No, absolutely, 100%. And then speaking of, we have another great opening of our comic book hero. So in 1975, a scratchy-voiced Harvey visits a throat doctor and exhibits hypochondria. But, to be fair, there's nodules on his throat, but it's because he's yelling all the time, apparently, which would make sense. He's kind of an angry guy.
In the early years of American Splendor, which, by the way, is a completely autobiographical comic book, he has not since the early 70s done a fictional comic book. Everything he's written has been in some way nonfiction. But a recurring issue for him, especially in the 70s, is that his voice will come and go from yelling too much. There's a particularly long stretch of stories that take place, which this represents, which I think is about 6 months, where he almost could not speak at all. But that's an on and off thing in the early years of American Splendor, as he would lose his voice.
So the next scene here, so Harvey's second wife decides their plebeian lifestyle just isn't working for her anymore. Without being able to speak, Harvey is powerless to convince her not to leave him. And you know what? I would kind of feel bad for him, but reading Wikipedia and the description of Harvey's second marriage, he sounds like a prick. So she was totally right for leaving him.
He has said that too. Yeah, he was like a miserable asshole.
A few months after that, a depressed Harvey is at his file clerk job at a VA hospital, which he held for pretty much his entire adult life before he retired in 2001. Mr. Boats, who I assume is a reoccurring character in the comic, but I'm not entirely sure, who is played by the actor Earl Billings in this movie, comes to offer advice to Harvey. The words of an Eleanor Wiley poem, which I'd never heard of them before, but this guy in this movie is a very fascinating figure. He strikes me as somebody who I would not want to talk to at work, I'll be honest.
Yeah, their dynamic is he's Harvey's friend because they work together. He's a nice enough guy. He's kind of weird, but they work together for years and years and they're buddies.
Fair enough. Just kind of like Toby a little bit, although we'll get to Toby in a little bit on that.
Toby and Harvey, I would say, were like best friends. Whereas the other people that Harvey works with, I think he's like okay with, even the ones he's friendly with. Toby was, for the rest of Harvey's life, I would say his best friend, other than his wife, Joyce. Sorry, not to get ahead.
No, it's all good. The narrative flashes back to 1962. While searching for old records at a yard sale, Harvey meets shy greeting card illustrator Robert Crumb, played by the actor James Urbaniak. A friendship is formed over a shared love of jazz and comic books. And also, the actor who plays Robert Crumb in this movie, I think, probably does a pretty good job. I've never seen an interview with Robert Crumb.
I mean, Urbaniak as Crumb is, of course, a very Hollywood idealized version of him. Crumb himself, really fascinating, really bizarre character in his own right. Has his own documentary, straightforward documentary about him and his family. That's pretty troubling, but fascinating. Urbaniak does well. He fulfills the function of being a sort of sanitized version of Robert Crumb. I think he plays Crumb quite a bit more charming and less kind of off-putting than he is. I am a fan of Crumb's work, but Urbaniak makes him seem very cool in this, which is not, I think, how you would feel about Robert Crumb if you just met him. But yeah, sparked up a close friendship with Harvey Pekar in the 1960s. That, obviously very formative for Pekar for the rest of his life.
Yeah, just looking at some pictures of Robert Crumb back in the day, he looks like either like a carnival barker or a carny or a sex offender.
Well, I don't know about any of that, but yeah, I mean, very extremely horny guy. Lots of things to say about his work, lots to argue about, lots of questionable things that I could spend all day considering and whether I think they're satire, what kind of person I think he is. Whereas I just love Harvey Pekar. I think he's a great literary wonder. Crumb is pretty complex and not always in a good way.
Yes. In fact, I saw a comic earlier he did, and I have to say he does a great job of just showing African-American characters in his comic. I'll just say that.
He is so great. So good.
Just don't look it up. It's about as racist as...
And it's one of those things, too, where it's like, I believe he thought he was being satirical, but like, to what end?
He makes H.P. Lovecraft look woke in that comic. It's really fucking racist.
Crumb did some nasty stuff. I'm not always sure what he was trying to say or even what he thought he was saying with some of that stuff. Maybe someday we'll talk about the Crumb documentary in depth, because that's a pretty disturbing documentary.
Well, let's get back into things that aren't disturbing. So, returning to 1975, a now famous Crumb is back in Cleveland for a visit. With his marriage over, Harvey is lonely and frustrated. He wants to leave a mark on the world. Afterwards, a sobering moment in the VA hospital's deceased files section leads Harvey to try drawing his own stories. But his lack of drawing talent stops him. An incident at the supermarket revives him as his animated subconscious goads him. Are you just going to stand there in silence? Are you going to make a mark on the world? Which, by the way, this scene's great. So Harvey's going to the grocery store. Some old fucking bitch is in front of him being a Karen about prices on like glasses and like cups or whatever. And you know what? For as much as I think we can debate the merits of self-checkouts got rid of these fucking cunts for the most part. And I really appreciate that.
Well, no, they didn't, because now these people are just confused in the self-checkout and don't know how to use it, and they complain for someone to come over.
Well, to be fair, I guess maybe it's because I go to stores that always have like a trillion self-checkouts, so I never have to worry about it.
I appreciate what you're saying, though.
Thank you, exactly. So any way to get rid of Karens, I will take pretty much any fucking just limit on convenience just to get rid of Karens. I will take that. If I do a job as a part-time cashier just to make sure that old cunts don't get a step above minimum wage workers, I'll be okay with that. That's fine by me. So, inspired, Harvey stays up all night writing. At a diner with Crumb, Harvey makes a pitch for a new kind of comic. He shows Bob the scripts he's been working on, and Crumb offers to illustrate them for him. And I love this scene in the diner once again, because he's just sort of like, yeah, well, you know, your drawing kind of sucks, but I really love your story. And Harvey's just like, wait, really? You actually like what I have to say? And it's like a validating moment for Harvey, because I feel like reading up a little bit on Harvey. So we didn't talk too much about Harvey's life. So he lived his entire life in Cleveland, Ohio. He grew up in a predominantly black neighborhood. He says himself that he got like the shit beat out of him a lot growing up because he was like the only white kid in his neighborhood.
And Jewish.
And Jewish too on top of it. Apparently his first language wasn't even English, it was Yiddish. So talk about just like isolated from society in every single fucking way. So he basically grew up as an outcast, and he worked the file clerk job his entire life, never really had much beyond a high school education. And once again, of course, living his entire life in Cleveland, Ohio, easily one of the most stomped on Rust Belt cities, if not the most stomped on Rust Belt city outside of maybe fucking St. Louis. So a type of guy who was just consistently shit on for the entire latter half of the 20th century. He embodies a very working class, you know, for lack of a better term, low educated type of like white guy in a Rust Belt city. And as somebody who lives in Milwaukee, which is the northwesternmost end of the Rust Belt city, I see guys like this all the fucking time.
Working class, little to no formal education, very like sensitive, very interested in literature, grew up in the house. They only spoke Yiddish and they were communists. In one of his memoirs, and not the Israel My Parents Promised, which was his first posthumous publication, I believe, he talks about his mom sending him around, going door to door in their neighborhood and handing out like communist pamphlets to their neighbors who would then berate him. A guy with, like you said, a pretty removed upbringing, probably a pretty retreating kid.
Yeah, pretty much as alienated as you could possibly get from the community around you and also from the wider culture at large. Like, pretty rough stuff, I will definitely say. But you know what? He had a voice. He fucking showed it to people, and some people definitely responded to it quite well. So at the end of the day, got to give him props for that, because not every, like, socially isolated working class white guy in a Rust Belt city can have that. In fact, most of them don't. And at this point, most of them are getting fucking high in fentanyl and killing themselves.
Yeah, no shit. Well, and I sort of think with the scene in the diner with Crumb, it's hard to read the way Urbaniak plays Crumb. It's hard to read how he really feels about Harvey. And part of you thinks he might be like, oh, I like my friend's writing. This is funny. I'll draw it as a lark because I'm bored. But for Harvey, this is the first time he's felt seriously impassioned about something in probably decades.
Oh, no, for sure. 100%. In the next scene here, Harvey proudly shows off his first issue of American Splendor #1 to his VA coworkers, including a man named Toby Radloff, played by the actor Joda Friedlander. Now, here's another guy who does a great fucking job. He sounds exactly like Toby in real life, because you see him quite a bit in this movie. He is a man who I would describe as the maybe most stereotypical nerd in existence. It is quite hilarious just how fucking nerdy this guy is. Like, you could have pulled him out of a movie. That's how nerdy this motherfucker is in real life.
And here's the thing that you need to remember, when you're imagining this. Toby grew up in the same area, in the same culture, in the same city as Harvey. So, like, guys like that weren't just around. He didn't, like, learn to be this, like, cartoonishly nerdy guy. That's just how he came out, fully formed.
Well, and that's the thing. I think both you and I have had this hypothesis for a while, but stereotypical, well, I should say quote unquote stereotypical nerd culture is basically just people who are on the spectrum. And I'm sorry, Toby is absolutely on the spectrum.
Yes, the classic nerd that you start seeing emerge in pop culture in like the 50s and 60s who dresses very formally and kind of talks like this and is socially like displaced in some way. That's just representations, and not always flattering or even necessarily accurate. That's representations or reflections by the culture of individuals with autism before it was an understood diagnosis or whatever. I 100% believe that. I am sorry. I know people are going to get pissed off at me for a million different reasons. I am so sure of that. The classic nerd that you see that is becoming less and less relevant as nerds become more diffuse. That classic nerd, that's just someone with autism.
Normies have appropriated nerd culture.
Like, that's kind of true, but it's also just like, who cares? Let them have it.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I like superheroes less than I used to because of that, because it's like less of my thing now. But also, I'm 31 years old. I don't need it anymore. Let them have it.
Exactly. So the narrative moves to 1984. Harvey has published 8 issues of American Splendor to critical acclaim but little financial gain. He's still a quote-unquote flunky file clerk. Harvey runs into Alice Quinn, played by the actress Maggie Moore, a woman he briefly knew in college. They catch up on each other's lives and talk about a novel I've never heard of before, of course, because I don't read, I'm illiterate. Harvey leaves their encounter feeling more alone than ever before. And you know what? That's also another sort of mundane experience that I think a lot of us had, where we run into somebody we knew from our past, and they've changed completely, sometimes in better or worse ways than we have. And it's like, oh my God, that could have been like me if we ended up being the exact same person, for better or worse.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing in this interaction. And Harvey, by the way, he's not like into Alice. He's just excited to see someone that he used to know because he's feeling lonely and someone that likes a book he likes. They're talking for a minute. He's also still, dealing with his divorce, with being alone. And there's this thing where he asks how she's doing and she says basically, oh, I got my degree and I'm a housewife now. And Harvey and Paul Giamatti does this great. It's more explicit in the comic strip it's based on, but I actually think just from Giamatti's performance here, you get it all. When she says that she's basically like a housewife, even though she got her degree, you get this weird mix of emotions from Pekar. He is kind of annoyed by her now, kind of disappointed that she's like this kind of basic suburban woman, and then also a sense of like kind of longing because he doesn't have anyone he's going home to. Like this really weird, complicated brew of feelings that's like, oh, this person was so smart and they ended up being so boring because Harvey Pekar's a judgmental asshole. So a revealing thing about me, I identify very much with the way Pekar talks about his resentments and the getting mad about things that don't matter. And like, that's one of the things that when I read him talk about, it's a very specific type of unflattering feeling that I don't see reflected firsthand by authors very much, that I really admire that he shows so fully. The Alice Quinn thing, before we move on from it, I think it's interesting because that comic strip, much like the scene, is very mundane. And I'm curious because there's so many little Harvey Pekar American Splendor strips that are just mundane little observational things, right? And I just think, like, why did they choose this one instead of the other ones? Because there's so many of them.
Very interesting artistic choice. I couldn't quite tell you why, obviously, because I'm not the filmmakers, but
I have an idea why, but it begs the question to me, how many of those other little sketches did they consider adding into a movie before deciding this was the one that works? And I actually, since it'll lead us right along, my idea why, and I think it's a good choice, is, again, by seeing Alice, Harvey is now thinking about how lonely he is. That strip and this scene are about him feeling a very lonely weekend where he just spends the whole day alone. And seeing Alice makes him more lonely because her life and her family thing is so far away from what he has. This is not how the comic strip leads into, but adapting this strip gives them a perfect segue into leading to the introduction of another character in Harvey's life.
Yes, and we're about to get that in just one moment, so just hold tight. But I have one more thing to say before we move on to that. So I think the one thing we could say the most about the scene is that she was somebody that he used to know. Okay, that was bad. I'm moving on to the next scene here. So
she didn't have to cut him off.
That's true.
And how's it going to be when she doesn't know him? And he doesn't want to know if she's lonely. These are 3 different songs now.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't even remember that line from the song. But anyways, let's get on to the script here once again. So, meanwhile in Delaware, Joyce Brabner, played by the actress Hope Davis, is frustrated with her partner in the comic book store, who has sold her copy of American Splendor #8 out from under her. She writes to Harvey, he responds, and they discover they are kindred spirits. Joyce then travels to Cleveland to meet Harvey in person. And I loved this scene where they go to the restaurant because it's like fucking TGI Fridays or something like that. I don't know what the fuck.
I think it is TGI Fridays.
That is such a not Harvey Pekar restaurant. It's very hilarious.
Or a Joyce restaurant, yeah. So both in the comic books and in this film, the Joyce Harvey dynamic, I love it. It's very romantic in a very honest way. And actually, during their correspondence, this is in a comic strip, but also it's probably my favorite exchange in this film. As someone who has nurtured a couple of relationships, including a pretty serious one for a length of time, by long distance correspondence leading to meeting someone, there's a scene where Joyce and Harvey have been talking on the phone now for a while. They're sending each other letters. And Harvey says, like, oh, when are you going to come out here and see me? And this is the funniest fucking shit. Joyce says, well, I don't really know what to expect because of how all of the other artists draw you. She says, when some of them draw you, you look like a younger Marlon Brando. But when Crumb draws you, you look like a hairy ape with stink lines undulating off of you. To which Harvey replies, those are emotion lines. I'm an active guy.
Which, to be fair, he is like a pretty fit guy for his age. So I will say that.
He walks everywhere.
That's true, because he doesn't have a car. Or presumably he doesn't have a car, but...
On and off, he has a car at different points in his...
Oh, that's actually true. Just like an average working class guy from a Rust Belt town, different bouts of having a car, usually beater shitty cars.
Oh, yeah, and that's always what he has. Harvey's a cheapskate. Why would he get a car that is not a beater? He doesn't need anything else.
But back at Harvey's apartment, Joyce is overcome with a bout of nausea and vomiting. A concerned Harvey offers her chamomile tea. Charmed, Joyce suggests they skip the whole courtship thing and get married, which I read online that apparently they did get married after the third date. And you know what?
Yes.
It lasted the rest of their lives. So, hey, you know what? It ended up working out just fine.
No joke. The Joyce-Harvey dynamic is that's relationship goals.
Because they definitely go through thick and thin, and they, to be fair, are at odds a lot of the movie, but they're very different types of individuals.
There's shocking to me how much of his honesty Harvey retained after getting married. Because it's one thing to be so starkly honest about yourself when you live alone and have no family. It's another to be that way about your wife. But again, I think Joyce understood how important that was for Harvey to not compromise that and to put that out there. And I think the truth is that everything in their relationship looks pretty healthy. There's bad habits and there's dysfunctions and there's arguments, and that's all in the comic book. But ultimately, that's his wife and he loves her very much. And I think she had trust that was going to be portrayed above all else ultimately. And I'd say it was. So in the comic strips, as I'm rereading them, he is actually a lot more outwardly affectionate towards her, like in public, than he is in the movie. And I kind of wonder if that was just like, I don't know if it's just they didn't have time to show it. I feel like the way Giamatti plays Harvey kind of makes him seem a little bit aloof in his interactions with her. Like, it almost makes Pekar look like one of those guys who had trouble showing affection or something, which is not really the case. He liked to hold her hand in public and give her kisses on the cheek, and he called her honey and baby. Not a huge difference, but something a little different from, I think, how the film portrays their relationship. So I thought that was interesting.
Well, you have to have a little bit more drama and conflict in a movie than in real life, even though this movie, once again, is a fairly dry retelling of Harvey Pekar's life up until that point.
The drama and the conflicts in this movie are real. They are in the comic books, but they are kind of made a bit more urgent in this.
So the next scene here, and this is a scene that I could talk about all day, but Harvey sees his VA colleague Toby once again sitting in his car eating White Castle sliders. Toby is on his way to Toledo to see the new movie Revenge of the Nerds. Meanwhile, Harvey is on his way to Delaware to marry Joyce and help her move out to Cleveland. And I thought this was really interesting. So I'm just going to skip the whole scene where they go to the Revenge of the Nerds screening because it's kind of a short scene. But Toby very much identifies with the nerds in that movie, which to me I think is a little disturbing, obviously, considering the implications of what the nerds
Toby doesn't know. Toby's taking that movie at face value.
No, I'm mostly kidding. And nobody really cared about that stuff back in the 80s, let's be honest, because, everybody from the 80s has been canceled at this point, or at least, has had accusations against them, I should say. But I think it's interesting. So, of course, Toby loves it. Fucking Joyce has some love for it, and fucking Harvey just absolutely despises it. He thinks it's a pile of shit. He thinks the characters in the movie are just going to become well-educated yuppies and not become fucking nerds anymore.
They're going to stop being nerds.
They're going to stop being nerds. Well, to be fair, I think they should stop being nerds because they raped that. Well, never mind. Let's not get into that. But yeah, that movie's pretty problematic by modern day standards. Let's be real.
Harvey's analysis of it is pretty fucking spot on.
Harvey's analysis is because you showed me one about Woody Allen earlier. They're all pretty spot on.
Harvey was fucking based. He was ahead of his time. Harvey is a working class guy who knew about art and jazz and literature because he taught himself. He didn't learn it from a college. That's how he learned about Marxism. He taught himself all that shit while he was doing fucking working class bum jobs. And yeah, he says to Toby, and I actually just read this strip last night just so I could compare and contrast them. But in pretty much word for word, what he says to Toby is the same. He says, the nerds in this movie aren't even supposed to be you. They're college kids who live with their parents in big houses in the suburbs. They didn't get their computers the way that you did by sending in box tops. They don't live with their grandmothers in an ethnic ghetto.
I do remember that line. I'm like, Jesus fuck, that's brutal.
Yeah. So a few things about the comic strip. This is actually one of the bigger differences between the film and the movie. In the comic strip, Toby sees the movie and is very excited and is telling Harvey about it. He's saying, oh, it's this movie. I feel uplifted by it. You know, it's about time that people getting picked on get to be the heroes. He starts wearing a pin on his shirt that says proud nerd. And Harvey, because Toby is his good friend, is like, okay, I'm going to go see this movie. Toby keeps talking about it. And then he talks to him. He sees him at work the next day and says, you know, hey, Toby, I saw that movie. And he says all the stuff he says to Toby here. Like word for word, he says that. But it's a little different. So this movie actually kind of makes Harvey look like a bigger asshole than he is. Because this scene, the way it's done in the movie, kind of implies that he's being hard on Toby because he's stressed out. When that is not like the reality based on the comic strip. When you read the comic strip, it doesn't seem like Harvey is yelling. It doesn't seem like he's mad or he's scolding Toby for liking the movie. And he says word for word the same things he says here. But it's more like he's like, yeah, I watched the movie you're talking about. I don't really think it's good. I don't really think that you should aspire to that, you know. It's not like he's like mad and he's just like, this is a stupid movie and you're stupid for liking it. Also, this scene does Joyce dirty because Joyce was not in that strip. Joyce did not go to the screening, or at least we don't hear anything about it, with Harvey to see that movie. Well, again, Toby and Harvey didn't see it together in reality. They have Joyce saying some stupid shit after they say this movie. At some point, she says, it's like the I have a dream speech, and that if everyone in the world could see this movie, it'd be just stupid shit that Joyce never would have said in reality. I don't know why they made that choice. Pretty insulting to her, because again, she isn't part of this conversation in the comic strip. There isn't really any need to have her here saying these dumb things, except for, I guess, to make her look like the dumb girlfriend. Probably my single biggest issue with the movie.
Well, fair enough. And also, talk about biggest issues. So their spat is interrupted by a message from a theater producer who wants to make American Splendor into a play. I don't know if this ever actually was made into a play or not, but Harvey and Joyce travel to Los Angeles to see American Splendor, the play, and Donald Logue and Molly Shannon play both Harvey and Joyce, respectively. Things are finally breaking for Harvey's way, but his ascendancy is complicated by Joyce's emotional struggles. She wants a family. Her desires are put aside again because a producer calls to offer Harvey a chance to be a guest on Late Night with David Letterman. And also to give a little bit of context. So Harvey, not really a kid's guy, understandable. He got a vasectomy pretty early on for what that procedure would have been in the 70s and 80s. That was not a very common thing to get back then. So he was really determined not to have children. And, you know, just in general, Joyce, she's somebody who's like an activist at heart. Like, she wants to make the world a better place. She always wanted to be a mother, but probably never found guys who were above just kind of dirtbag, sort of burnout dudes to have kids with.
Yeah.
Just never did. And then she finds Harvey and she's like, oh, this guy's just so handsome. He lives in a shitty apartment in Cleveland. That's a guy I'm going to have kids with. But either way, so she wants a family, he doesn't, and it gets resolved eventually, but not in the way you might think. I'll just say that. They eventually adopt a young girl who's the daughter of a comic book artist, but we'll get to that point when we get to it. But either way, so
we're at Letterman. He's been invited to Letterman, and he's getting more success from the comic, more notoriety, and it's happening as his marriage with Joyce, you know, is blossoming, and it's leading to complications.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, so he eventually ends up once again on the David Letterman show. And I like this because they actually showed the real David Letterman interview here. And you know what? I think Harvey's fucking great on it. He is willing to give David Letterman shit because David Letterman was definitely not the worst late night host, but he's kind of a hack. Let's be honest here.
So I watched a lot of late night comedy as a kid. I would say of the network guys, Letterman was pretty good. Pretty funny, good comic timing, pretty likable, but still a late night guy. And all of them, except for Conan, who I love, and I think you'll agree he's one of our kings. He's one of our sweet boys. All those late night hosts, yeah, they're kind of hacks.
Not to say he's the worst comedian or TV host of all time, but pretty much all those late night hosts, yeah, except for Conan, are pretty much giant hacks, I'll be honest with you. I would still rather take Letterman over fucking Jimmy Fallon or Jimmy Kimmel. Any of the Jimmys. I fucking hate those guys.
Or Leno, who's the fucking British piece of shit.
James Corden?
James Corden.
Anyone with a J name, fuck off, basically.
Fuck him. Fuck him.
But yeah, so he ends up once again on the David Letterman show, and he comes back for multiple appearances. Meanwhile, Toby becomes an MTV star, which I never knew about. He apparently was in a bunch of like low-budget movies and stuff like that, which is hilarious. He became kind of like a cult figure. I would have never guessed that in a million years.
Yeah, I think for MTV, I don't think Toby, I mean, obviously, and Harvey, they say this in the film, and Harvey writes about it at length. He felt like Toby was kind of being mocked and co-opted, and he felt the way about himself on Letterman after a point. But I sort of think part of the thing too is that in some silly way, MTV felt like Toby would be like a new wave guy. Like they could sort of equate him as a VJ to like Devo or something.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the idea of like, yeah, this like just fucking nerdy, sort of fairly off-putting guy just hanging out in Cleveland. It's like, that's going to be our new guy. It's just very funny to me. But to be fair, MTV was always kind of doing that. Eventually, they struck out gold when they found, fucking grunge in the Seattle scene.
Yeah, but early MTV, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent. Early MTV, pretty innovative and pretty fly-by-night. Pretty
very much so, yeah.
Almost like cable access at times. Yeah, there's pretty interesting stuff on early MTV because they really did need to find things that were, music-based to fill up a fucking whole broadcast day on early cable.
No, that's the thing. Music-based and kind of based. No. But yeah, so meanwhile, Joyce is looking for fulfillment of her own as a creator and as an activist. Against Harvey's wishes, she goes away to a peace conference in Israel, Palestine or something like that. I can't remember exactly where.
Yes, I believe so. She did a lot of activist comic strips later on. I don't remember at this point what she's working on.
One lonely night, Harvey discovers a mysterious lump on his groin, and that will come into play at the end of the movie. Joyce is still away on her mission, and a scared and bitter Harvey makes another appearance on The Letterman Show. He dons an On Strike Against NBC shirt, and the show goes downhill from there, winding up in chaos, which once again, as I said earlier, it's a little bit overblown from what it actually was, but it was a fairly tense interview, because he does not come across as very jokey like he does in his first interview.
I also reread all of the Letterman strips last night. One of the things in the first couple of appearances is that Harvey, and I think it is true in this, there's a scene in the film where the film version of Joyce feels that Harvey is pandering when he starts going on Letterman. And I think that's fair. And I think she probably Harvey felt that to some degree where he's going, he says in the comic strip, Harvey himself says, Letterman's an all right guy. He even says like, hey, his politics are, about the best as you can expect from like a guy on his level, which pretty true. Letterman pretty much like a lib, which in the 80s for that level of fame, sure, he's like, yeah, he supports WGA, he supports SAG, and Pekar says that in his own comic strips, but he's also like just kind of like a schmuck. The first couple appearances on Letterman Show, they're fake combative. In fact, in the comic strip, he says that before his second appearance, Letterman came up to him and said like, hey, I just wanted to clear some stuff up because there was some miscommunication. And Letterman's kind of trying to big dog Pekar because his first appearance, they're kind of getting into it in a semi-joking way. And he says, hey, people don't want to hear me talk. They want to hear you talk. So how about I just ask the questions and you answer? And Pekar's kind of like, yeah, whatever. And then Letterman says, and remember, you could push back on me and argue because that makes for good TV. Just remember, the audience is always going to be on my side because it's my show. Yeah. And shit like that. He's trying to big dog him. And I think the whole thing is that Pekar, he sees Letterman as a bigger opportunity than it ends up being. It is probably true that it didn't really help his comic books. A thing that the producers and Letterman keep saying are like, hey, you're a funny guy, be funny on the show. And Harvey Pekar, even in his comic books, isn't a guy who wants to be funny all the time. That's not like his deal. He's not a comedian. On his second or third appearance, I think his second appearance, he tells the producers, they say, what do you want to talk about? And he says, oh, here's the thing I've been thinking about. It's not really funny, but it's kind of interesting. And a producer cuts him off and says, well, we don't want interesting. Nobody cares about interesting. This is a comedy show, so we want you to be funny. And, Harvey, of course, feels frustrated by that. The third or fourth appearance is when he shows up with the on strike from NBC shirt. And in reality, Pekar had been trying to talk about the GE issues and all of these things, all of these defense contracts that GE has and how they own NBC and, all of their antitrust violations and all these other things that they were doing that were unethical or were anti-labor. And Letterman was kind of dodging them in various ways. So in this appearance, Harvey said, I'm just going to come out and start talking about it. It's all I'm going to talk about. The show doesn't end up in chaos, Taylor, as he said. So the movie makes it look like Harvey blows up. And he's like, I'm not going to take this shit. The actual tenor of the interview is a little bit more like Harvey is like, I'm going to stay on the show and I'm going to keep my composure and try to say what I want to say. Like, he is still kind of playing in the context of like an interview. And then Letterman is sort of half joking with him. Like, he's joking, not joking, and saying, well, when you have your show, you can talk about whatever you want. Where, he's kind of being funny with it, but he's not joking. But yeah, the film makes it look like it's this big blow up because they want more conflict than that. The reality is that he was on the show a couple times after that and did always say impressed that he thought that Letterman was mostly a genuine guy to him and mostly was a fan of his work and that he liked being on TV the first couple of times, which also might just be a professional courtesy.
No, for sure. All right, so yeah, let's continue on here. So Joyce finally returns from her trip, but she also once again discovers Harvey's lump on his testicles. Harvey is diagnosed with lymphoma. Joyce suggests he makes a comic book of the whole thing, but Harvey just wants to die, which, spoilers to the audience at home, he later did die accidentally from an overdose of his anti-anxiety medication. So maybe he just always wanted to die. In fact, he was actually about to go in for treatment for his third cancer diagnosis. So cancer was just trying to get him the entire fucking time.
Yeah, the family history of cancer and other illnesses, I think he always kind of saw it coming. I'm going to say to the audience, if you're going to read one Harvey Pekar book, I mean, I would pick one of the two American Splendor treasuries. But if you wanted just a single, like a novel-length book, there is an argument to be made that Our Cancer Year is his best work, the graphic novel that he wrote with Joyce about his illness.
Undeterred, Joyce enlists the comic book writer, or I should say illustrator, Fred, played by James McCaffrey. Now, I did want to mention James McCaffrey because I didn't know this until I read his Wikipedia article. He was the voice of Max Payne, so that's fucking hilarious. Just Max Payne is in this movie as like a minor role.
Incredible.
Fred brings along his young daughter, Danielle, on their first brainstorming session, and Joyce is smitten with the little girl. Harvey reluctantly agrees to participate in the comic, and he asks Fred to keep bringing along Danielle. And of course, they eventually becomes like a surrogate family to Danielle as well. In fact, I think she's actually at the very end of the movie at the retirement scene, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, she is.
So, in the very last couple scenes of the movie here, so Harvey's treatment is traumatic and tumultuous. One night, an adult Harvey wonders if he's real or if he is just a character in a comic book, and whether the story will end or continue if he dies. In one continuous take, Harvey wanders through a dreamscape, musing about other individuals he finds in the Cleveland telephone book that are also named Harvey Pekar, which I thought was a really funny way to end this film. He's like, was it Harvey L. Pekar?
So that strip is very good. That is...
Oh, that's an actual strip too?
Yep, that is just a standalone strip. It's basically just exactly like it is in the film. And it usually either opens or ends treasuries of his work.
And in the very last scene here, about 1 year after Harvey is cleared of having cancer, they go to a signing of Our Cancer Year. And of course, that's where that comic illustrator shows up earlier that I mentioned in trivia. They adopt Danielle, and Harvey adjusts to being a parent. The real Harvey retires, and this is the very last scene. We see everybody in the movie that he's been talking about this whole time, and of course, oftentimes showed up in his comics, including Toby. And he just has a nice little retirement party, and it's just a very cute little scene. And then unfortunately Harvey would die 10 years later accidentally. So very sad. But either way, it's nice because you know what? Harvey probably didn't retire with too much money. I mean, he got a pension, which is something, and he probably got meager returns from his comic.
He probably was all right. He was probably okay.
And I think he mentioned somewhere, he's like, well, if I can, squeeze out a couple good years after I retire, then I'm doing pretty good, I guess.
Between my pension and the chunk of change from this movie, if I can get a window of good health between now and retirement, that'll be enough or something like that.
Yeah, something like that, exactly. But yeah, so that is the end of this movie. So before we get on to Amazon reviews, do you have any thoughts before we get into those, Brian?
If anyone is interested in Harvey Pekar, I want to say this is not a bad entry point to Harvey. If you're interested, this movie was made to transcend the alternative comic book, the Harvey Pekar comic book audience. So it's meant to be more accessible, maybe, than his work, although I certainly don't think his work is inaccessible. If you see this movie and you really like it, I would say that it's worth reading some of his strips. But I also think that there's an audience for this movie that might not be interested in his work because it's a very condensed version of his story. If you are interested in his work, there's a lot of good places to start. There are 3 different kind of classic era American Splendor treasuries. American Splendor, The Life and Times of Harvey Pekar, More American Splendor, both published by Doubleday in 1986 and 1987. The New American Splendor anthology in 1991. Between those 3, you'll pretty much get all of the comic strips that inform this film. And then there's Our Cancer Year. Came out in 1994. By 94, the series American Splendor pretty much was over. From, I believe, 91 is when American Splendor formal, as a twice a year or whatever, comic book ended. And then Pekar would just write when he had a project he wanted to do. American Splendor came back a couple times as a miniseries. He wrote several graphic novels that, I like, but there's a lot of variety there. Your mileage may vary. I would say if you wanted to start somewhere, I'd start with The Life and Times of Harvey Pekar and the American Splendor anthology. And then if you really like those, I'd go to Our Cancer Year. Our Cancer Year is not funny a lot of the time because it's just about cancer. It's just him writing about his experience with cancer and chemotherapy in real time. Just the stark vulnerability in it, though, is, I think, really admirable. He enjoys writing about everything in it. They write about how it affects his health. They write about how it affects their marriage. It's a very intimate peek into that process if you want to know what it's like without having to actually get cancer. Beyond that, there's a lot of graphic novels, not necessarily American Splendor novels. He, of course, did Our Movie Year, which came out after this film and is about, the year the movie was made and the time after it when he was sort of doing press junkets for it and what it was like becoming significantly more famous because of a movie. He did The Quitter, which is basically about his childhood and, pre-American Splendor years and how he would quit all his jobs and was kind of drifting. He wrote a graphic novel biography about Students for a Democratic Society. Again, not an American Splendor book. It's very formal. It's very historic. He wrote that. And then he also wrote a book called The Beats about all of the beat writers and their history, which are, very academic books. And that's basically him saying, here's what I liked. Here's what inspired me and helped form my beliefs. And then a lot of little projects here and there. But between those 2 early American Splendor anthologies and Our Cancer Year, you'd be sitting pretty. Couple later works he did posthumously published Not the Israel My Parents Promised Me, one of my favorite books he ever did, but not necessarily a good entry point, very political. And last but not least, an as yet unpublished work. Taylor, I just want to tell you about this so that you can just imagine what it might be. A graphic novel that has been completed, that Joyce has been in talks to release with different publishers, but has never been able to agree on. A Pekar work called The Unrepentant Marxist, a history of his personal radicalization and his politics and their growth throughout their life. I would love to see this work, but who knows? Maybe it'll get published and it'll just completely suck, and it will end with him being like, and now, shortly before my death, I realized that I was a libertarian all along, and that it'll ruin Harvey for me forever. Who knows?
He becomes an ANCAP, yeah.
Shatters my feelings about him.
The comic just ends with, but what if the child consents?
Well, that would be a Robert Crumb.
Well, you know what? Speaking of things that may be bad or good, let's get into some Amazon reviews because, oh man, these are some amazing Amazon reviews for this movie. So the first one I have here is from CookieMan108, who gives this 5 stars. And the head of the review says, ordinary life is pretty complex stuff. And just sit tight, Brian. This is a pretty long interview, but, it's a 5-star review. So, you got to give a little credit there. But so being familiar with Harvey Pekar's comic book, American Splendor, I was really pleased to see the movie was about as close to the source material as any other movie I've ever seen. I haven't had an opportunity to read Our Cancer Year, a graphic novel by Harvey and his wife Joyce about Harvey's bout with cancer, but that storyline is also incorporated into this movie. Harvey Pekar, played by Paul Giamatti, leads an ordinary life in the city of Cleveland, working as a file clerk in a VA hospital, divorced twice, scours garage sales and thrift stores for rare jazz records, is thoroughly well-read, and observes the people in his life and his surroundings fairly closely, taking it all in, good and bad. Harvey does tend to a rather morose individual, or I should say does tend to be a rather morose individual. I think they put a typo in there, but I could be wrong about that. So don't come into this movie looking for tales of happiness and joy, and also Harvey does say that at the beginning of this movie as well. A chance meeting with a greeting card artist and future underground comic legend Robert Crumb develops into a long-standing friendship to their similar interests. Once Crumb became famous for his unusual style of comic books, which that's putting it lightly, once again, especially his very loving portrayals of African Americans, Harvey decides he wants to try his hand at it, creating, with the help of Crumb's illustrations, stories about his life titled American Splendor. No superheroes here, but more of a realistic portrayal of his own life, warts and all. Soon he develops cult fame and meets his future wife Joyce, a comic book store owner from Delaware. Harvey's fame manifests itself in a sort of bizarre fashion, leading to a number of appearances on David Letterman's late night talk show, and even trickles down to people he knows and includes in his comic book. Specifically, his ultra nerdy coworker and friend, Toby Radloff, played wonderfully by Judah Friedlander. Now, I did want to mention Judah Friedlander because I don't know if you're familiar with Judah Friedlander. I don't like him in general. I don't think he's a very interesting entertainer, but he's good in this movie. I will give him that.
I don't think I know anything about him, to be totally honest with you.
If I'm not mistaken, he's one of those like really annoying weed guys.
Oh.
And he doesn't look anything like his portrayal in this movie now. He's got like a big beard and just like long, just really unkempt looking hair. If that's the guy I'm thinking of, he's just really annoying.
Who's
like,
the guy that's super high-me?
Oh, Doug Benson?
Yeah, is he like Doug Benson?
I think he's kind of like Doug Benson, yeah. I don't like him, but you know what? He's good in this movie. I will give him credit for that. One of the things I really enjoyed about this movie was the inclusion of the real-life Harvey Pekar and other people in his life, once again, such as his wife, Joyce, and his very odd friend, Toby. Harvey does some narration and appears in a few scenes with other real-life people who are portrayed by actors in the movie in between the scenes, if that makes sense. It actually does make sense. It's not very hard to understand why. That wild, crazy, wacky thing, yeah. It's crazy.
I'm freaking out.
Yeah. It allows for a comparison between the actors playing the characters and the real-life people those characters are based on. It sounds like it would be a little disjointed, but the directors pull it off wonderfully. What was most interesting to me was just how much Paul Giamatti got into the character of Harvey. From physical appearance, speech, dress, attitude, and even mannerisms. Sometimes I wasn't sure if I was watching Paul Giamatti's Harvey Pekar or the real Harvey Pekar. Actually, I can, because Harvey Pekar is a very interesting individual, and Paul Giamatti looks just like a normal dude.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Giamatti, I'm sorry. I'm going to say once again, sorry, Harvey. He is the highly idealized, good-looking Harvey Pekar.
He is the hot Harvey Pekar. Oh, jeez. One of my favorite scenes is one where Harvey discusses the peculiarity of his name and how odd it was that he found a couple of other people in the phone book who shared his name. Presented in a widescreen format, the movie looks great. Also included are a plethora of extras, including a reprint of a comic insert Harvey Pekar created for Entertainment Weekly, a group commentary including the real Harvey Pekar, a featurette, and a few hidden items that aren't too hard to find. So that is the review here. This was the highest rated review on Amazon I could find for this movie, so I wanted to include it here. And I agree with some of it, but honestly, this guy just doesn't seem to really get some of the stuff in here.
Yeah, I would agree. So this is fine. I do agree with him. This is probably the best possible adaptation of American Splendor you could make on this scale. This is a pretty big studio film. Not huge, but given a decent budget and probably given a good amount of studio notes. So taking that into consideration that this isn't some super DIY indie film, the best possible adaptation of Pekar's work that we could expect. They did pretty good. I don't know. I kind of feel like this guy is sort of downplaying the depth that Harvey gives to the people around him. But I actually think, especially in the comic strips, like there's a lot of thought given to, say, the people at the VA that Harvey works with, to the people that he meets on the street or on the bus. And I kind of feel like maybe it's just that it's just a review and this guy isn't getting really in depth with his feelings because it's just a review. It sort of seems to me a little bit like writing off those sides of him. Even though Harvey himself says he's a gloomy guy, I don't think that's a very accurate description of him. There's other sides to him. And I see a lot of people, when they kind of sum up Harvey Pekar, they say, oh, he's glum or he's bitter or something. And I always feel like that does a little bit of a disservice to him as a writer and as a person.
I mean, that's the thing, right? Is that behind every cynical person is a disappointed idealist. Like, I think that's kind of what Harvey was.
Harvey is a very idealistic person. And I think that's one of the things that makes me love his work so much is that his idealism is like pretty unwavering, even though he tries to be a realist all the time. To me, that's almost like his defining inner conflict is his idealism and his realism kind of butting up against each other.
Absolutely. So yes, let's get to the next review here. I thought I had a segue, but you know what? I don't. Let's just get right in this motherfucking next review because this is a much shorter review, but it is also a positive review. So J.R. Pinto gives this 4 stars, and the head of their review says, great metafictional movie. And the body of the review says, American Splendor may be one of the best movie adaptations of a comic book that I have ever seen.
Probably.
Well, that's the thing. It was also a pretty early comic book adaptation, if you think about it. Do you think Harvey Pekar should be in the MCU?
Oh, yeah, please. He did have some work that was published by DC.
Really?
On their Vertigo imprint, much later on.
Oh, okay. I would have loved to see him fight fucking Thanos. That would have been great now, but...
I'd love to see him be Thanos, be a supervillain.
Well, that's the thing, though. Once again, I said Paul Giamatti played Rhino in The Amazing Spider-Man, I think, 1. So you know what?
There is precedent.
But yes, so you see, there's really a guy named Harvey Pekar who writes a comic book entitled American Splendor, which is based on his life. This movie is based on that comic book and the guy's real life. The film is half documentary and half docudrama. Pekar narrates the film himself. That's me, he says. Really, it's the actor they have playing me. He really doesn't look anything like me. All of the actors' real-life counterparts appear. Paul Giamatti gives a great performance as Pekar. The movie is very funny and very innovative in the way it merges live action with animation. So I want to say, Mr. J.R. Pinto, I understand you had 5 minutes to write this movie report for school.
Animation.
But you should put a little bit more effort into your school project here. I'm just going to say that.
Well, he's making this sound like this is like Roger Rabbit.
Well, and like I said earlier, like this does really read to me like he had 10 minutes to do like a movie report for school and he just wrote a couple sentences down.
He did that trick where, you watch the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes of the movie.
But this was also one of the higher rated reviews. So I guess people on Amazon did the same exact thing. They're like, oh, I did that for this movie too.
Yeah, this guy, thanks, guy.
Oh, and then speaking of thanks, you're going to love this last review here. I've been saving this one for last because, oh my God, this is going to make you so mad. I just know it. So this review here is from Thaddeus Marcum, who I believe is related to the legendary Lucas Marcum, or I'm sorry, I believe Luke Marcum, who was in the gay porno Harry Potter knockoff film, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Balls. So this person gave this film 1 star, and the head of the review says, a nerd film for elitist a-holes. And the body of the review says, there they stand in safe New York studio apartments in their skinny, disproportionately crafted looking, smug and very middle European as they hold expensive champagne with white gloves and giggle at the cute absurdity found in American Splendor. This, my friends, is a depiction of the psychotic element of film critics who made of the 2.3% of the viewing world who actually enjoy this pile of wrathful bile. American Splendor is the type of pathetic film that makes one wonder just how in the hell it made it to the big screen. Did Harvey Pekar sell his soul to the devil in exchange for having his later life made into a movie? Do you want a plot synopsis? Well, the plot deals with a seedy comic book man in a series of seedy breakups with a seedy girlfriend in a seedy neighborhood. Seriously, people, why should we care? And in parentheses, writhing lunatic fan of this film to press no on the was this helpful section in T-minus 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I mean, I almost don't want to respond to this because I feel like this is like a troll review, right?
That's a fucked up thing. This was the highest rated negative review, so I had to include it on here.
But it's interesting because I expected there to be some negative reviews. And I love this movie. I expected there to be negative reviews by people who were big fans of the comic book who thought that this was kind of like too Hollywood. You know what I mean? But this is like a cliche. Like, first of all, seedy? I don't know. That's not exactly a word I would use to describe just a working class guy in Cleveland.
Yeah, he's not like fucking shooting up heroin and like fucking prostitutes. He's just like kind of a normal guy.
But also the idea, I guess, that the people that like Harvey's comics or relate to them are all the champagne sipping like yuppies that live in lofts. I mean, I don't really understand that. And that's why I'm not as mad about it as maybe you're expecting, is because I kind of don't understand it. Like, this person's premise is that a bunch of champagne socialists are reading Harvey Pekar, I guess.
I kind of think that too, yeah, like hoity-toity,
Like-
yeah, champagne liberals or like limousine liberals type people being like, ooh, look at this seedy gentleman in his weird life. And it's like, I don't think
But-
that's Harvey Pekar's fan base, if I'm being honest.
This guy seems to think it's like a Wes Anderson thing, I guess. The thing is, Harvey's stories aren't really quirky. They're not really goofy or odd or weird. They're very everyday, you know? Obviously, he goes on Letterman and shit, but he also, you know, sees an old classmate at the coffee shop and he gets a little sad about talking to her for a few minutes. You know, he has an awkward friend at work and shit like that. He goes to see a movie and he doesn't like it, and his friend, you know, it's very like normal, like observational stuff. So first of all, I 100% get the type of person writing this review. I know exactly who it is, but I don't understand what their idea of American Splendor, the film or the book or the person Harvey Pekar, I don't know what they think it is exactly.
Well, and that's the thing.
Like-
I think we know who this guy is. I mean, he's the brother of famous gay porn actor Luke Marcum. I think we all know that.
He's jealous of Mark.
Have you ever seen Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Balls, Brian?
No, I've not seen Harry Potter. Are you sure it's Harry Potter? It's not like a pun name.
No, it's Harry Potter.
Harry Potter. Sorry,
Harry
of
Potter
course,
and the
of course.
Sorcerer's Balls.
So Harry Potter is in front of me, but I was trying not to laugh. But Sorcerer's Balls is really good because it's not even like a pun, you know.
Yeah, it's definitely a interesting movie. I'll just say that. It's also filmed entirely in 3D. It's in red green 3D.
I'm not gonna watch it if you can't get me the glasses. Okay, I'm either gonna get the full experience or not at all.
Oh, God. But yes, with that out of the way, those are our Amazon reviews. So, Brian, do you have any last thoughts before we end this episode? Because I am an old-ass millennial, and I need to take my arthritis medication before I go to bed.
I think this is a very accessible movie. I think if you like comedies, if you like dramas, especially if you like things that mix the two, if you're a fan of, and I don't like all these people, but I'd say if you're a fan of maybe Woody Allen, again, who I don't like, I think sucks, and Harvey thought he sucked too, but I do think there's some parallels there. If you're a fan of Woody Allen, if you're a fan of Larry David, if you're a fan of Lenny Bruce, or even like Karlov Nausgaard, author of My Struggle, someone who does like kind of observational, existential comedy stuff about like the mind and the day-to-day life, you'd probably like Harvey Pekar. You'd probably like this movie for sure, even if you don't feel like you need to dive into the man's literature. And if you really like this movie and you want to read the real Harvey Pekar's work, there's a lot of great volumes over there. I went through them, not exhaustively, but I'd say I went through over all the big ones that you could start with. There's 3 different American Treasury collections to jump out with. Again, we always say that, you know, the base lib doesn't exist anymore, but this is like an even rarer breed, and I think an even more dying breed. And I would like a lot of people my age and maybe younger to seek out people like this, because I do think it's important to look at, like, I guess, figures in the past who aren't encased in amber in this sort of, this is what boomers were like, this is what Gen Xers are like. It's important to like see people that relate to what you're saying now and going through, and to know that those people have always been there. And I think for me, Harvey is that person. He's this person I go back to and I go like, oh, there's always been people like me. There's always been people like us, and that they're probably a much bigger segment of it than we realize. I unequivocally recommend this movie if you like dramatic comedies, and I, without any reservation, recommend Harvey Pekar's writing. He's a fantastic writer. And I think he would speak to a lot of old millennials, given that we all have weird existential crisis all the time.
No, for sure. I'll say for my final thoughts, I really liked the movie. I've liked the various comics that you've shown me. I think that Harvey, and, you know, as we've mentioned many times throughout this episode, seemed like a very interesting, introspective, cynical, but I would say at the end of the day, kind-hearted individual who just kind of wanted to make the world a better place in his own way, or at least try to relate to other people in his own way. And I respect that, because as somebody who also is not the most educated individual in existence and kind of works a fairly dead-end job, I make an okay income, but it's a fairly dead-end job. Like, I feel the way that Harvey feels a lot of the time as well, just walking throughout the day, just like, man, it's just the drudgeries of fucking life every day, and I have to interact with individuals that kind of annoy me and shit. And like, I understand a lot of where Harvey's coming from in his portrayal of his comics to a certain extent.
Well, and that's the thing, right? I think if we're talking about, the podcast is Millennials Are Old. And I think what you see from old millennials, I refuse to say elder. I hate when people use that fucking word. I think it's fucking corny. But if you're like, feel like you're getting older, you're like in your late 20s or you're in your 30s now, like I'm going to be 32 in a couple of months, then what you feel like is basically like you're stuck in this quote unquote late capitalism thing. We're kind of stuck. Technology and development has us stuck in this like modernity and constantly overstimulated by things around us, but we're still not moving into a future. We're just kind of stuck where we're at. We're just going on forward. We're eking by. And really the only thing I think a lot of us feel like we can hope for is to forge some small connection with each other rather than any big change. And I think that's kind of what Harvey felt. And I feel like maybe it says like, hey, if all you can do is go a day at a time and make those little connections with people, like maybe that's enough.
No, hell yeah. I think that's honestly a great way to end it because I don't have much more to add to it. But you know what I do have to add, Brian? I have to add our pluggables. So you can follow me at carloschantor on twitter.com. And also you can follow us on Spotify. Give us a follow on Spotify at Millennials Are Old Podcast.
Thank you so much for doing that, Taylor. That is awesome. Really excited to have the show on an actual streaming service. Please jump into that backlog. I think we have a lot of fun stuff there. Still some episodes, especially earlier episodes that I think were pretty good, that I'm pretty proud of. You know, I'd love to get a little bit of discussion on if anyone decides to go back and listen to them. If you want to argue with us, if you want to tell us you love us, if you want to form a parasocial relationship with us, send me money, please do that. And you can follow me on Twitter at John Stab on Twitter. JONSTABB. Yeah, I think I'm also JLo Biafra on Instagram. Because I'm an old millennial, I'm on all of the apps.
Hell yeah. And you can follow us on Grindr at Millennials. No, we're not on that social media platform, but
oh my God, but imagine being the first podcast to get on Grindr and we would corner the market, that section of the market.
Well, you know what? I know about gay porn actors clearly, so but yes, definitely stay tuned for our review of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Balls. We're not actually reviewing that.
Oh my God, Taylor, hang on. Listeners, and Taylor, I typed in millennial and podcast on Spotify, and I found our enemy show. I'm going to read it. The Nostalgic Millennial Podcast.
Yes!
Return with us to the 90s as we do a deep dive into the shows, movies, games, and more that defined our generation. This is like the Earth One version of us.
Now you said Nostalgic Millennial?
Nostalgic Millennial Podcast.
Is it hosted by the Nostalgia Critic?
No, I'm sure it's not.
God, fuck. Talk about amazing actors that would be an interesting person to portray. Well, that's the thing, though, is that Quentin Tarantino was making a movie about the Nostalgia Critic.
I don't even know what the Nostalgia Critic's up to. I still refuse to watch his wall review. I'm going to start beef with other podcasters now. I'm going to find all the other millennial podcasts and be like, you know what, Nostalgic Millennial Podcast? You're fucking soy. Your show sucks. I haven't even listened to it yet, but I can tell your reviews are bullshit. Fuck you. I hate your fucking fake-ass early 90s font. We are the Millennial Podcast. We'll fucking put you in the ground.
Yeah, we'll fucking beat you down. And also, if you're interested in doing an interview, we would love to interview you while we make fun of you.
We're going to be like Outlaw and be like, you know what? You suck. You are bad people. I hate you. But also, we should do a collab.
Yes. And speaking of, look forward to our collab with Outlaw on YouTube.
Oh my God. Should we get a hold of Outlaw?
All right. But with all that, hell yeah, dude. Let's fucking do it. That's the thing, though. We want to keep the audience on edge. So without further ado, have a good night, everybody. Once again, we will interview Outlaw very soon, but probably not. But yes, once again, have a good night, everybody.